It was a serene morning in Maplewood Heights, the kind of suburban neighborhood where every lawn was a flawless green carpet and each house looked like it had been plucked straight from the pages of a magazine. Mark Johnson stood on his front porch, cradling a steaming mug of coffee as the sun slowly climbed over the rooftops. It was a rare moment of tranquility in his otherwise whirlwind life. His older brother, David, was finally on the mend after a horrific car accident 6 months prior that had confined him to a wheelchair. Despite everything, David had never once let it get him down. He was a fighter, after all, a newly elected state senator with a razor-sharp mind and an indomitable will. But that morning, the peace didn't last long. Mark's brow furrowed as he noticed something taped to their front door. Another glaring orange violation notice from the Homeowners Association. His heart sank like a stone, and a wave of frustration washed over him as he ripped the notice from the door. It was the third one this month, all targeting the wheelchair ramp they had painstakingly built for David. According to the HOA, the ramp was an unapproved structure that marred the neighborhood's pristine aesthetics. Mark crumpled the notice in his fist and stormed inside, where David was already waiting, his eyebrows arched in question. "Another one?" David asked, his voice calm but tinged with irritation. "Yep. Apparently, our ramp is single-handedly plummeting property values," Mark replied, tossing the crumpled paper onto the kitchen counter. "It's gotta be Eleanor Harding again." Eleanor Harding was the president of the Maplewood Heights HOA, a self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac who ruled with an iron fist and a saccharine smile. She possessed an uncanny knack for transforming the most minor infractions into major offenses, overgrown hedges violation, trash cans visible from the street double violation. But targeting the wheelchair ramp, that was a new low, even for her. Mark peered through the front window, and sure enough, there she was. Eleanor Harding stood at the edge of her driveway, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair gleaming in the sunlight, a clipboard clutched in her manicured hands. She was snapping pictures of their house like some kind of suburban paparazzi, her lips curled into a smug smile as she scribbled something down. "She's relentless," Mark muttered. "It's like she doesn't sleep." "Let it go, Mark," David said, smoothly rolling his wheelchair toward the kitchen table. "We've got the permits. We did everything by the book. There's nothing she can do." Mark wasn't so sure. Eleanor had a way of bending the rules to fit her agenda. He'd witnessed it too many times before. "I don't trust her," he said, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. "She's planning something. I can feel it." That feeling only intensified the next morning. Mark was helping David into his car for a physical therapy appointment when he spotted Eleanor huddled with two men in dark suits near her house. They were pointing at the ramp, gesturing animatedly, while one of them jotted notes in a leather-bound notebook. Eleanor's face was illuminated by that all-too-familiar smile, the one she wore when she was up to no good. "I don't like this," Mark said, watching them from the corner of his eye. "She's planning something big." "Relax, Mark," David said. "We'll handle it through the proper channels. No need to escalate things." But Mark wasn't convinced. He pulled out his phone and started recording, just in case. It was a habit he'd picked up over the past few months, documenting every interaction with Eleanor, every violation notice, every suspicious glance. Something in his gut told him they'd need it. His instincts were chillingly accurate. The next day, just as the first rays of dawn painted the sky, Mark was jolted awake by the deep rumble of heavy machinery outside. He bolted to the window, his heart pounding in his chest. A bright yellow bulldozer sat ominously in their driveway, its massive metal blade gleaming menacingly in the early morning light. Two workers in bright orange vests were measuring the ramp, while Eleanor stood nearby, her scarlet blazer practically glowing in the sunlight. She clutched a stack of papers to her chest like they were the keys to some tyrannical kingdom. "What do you think you're doing?" Mark shouted, bursting out the front door, his voice raw with disbelief and fury. Eleanor turned to face him, her smile as fake as the designer handbag slung over her shoulder. "Oh, good morning, Mark," she chirped, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I have here an emergency order from the HOA board. The structure is in direct violation of community guidelines. It has to be removed immediately. Mark's jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. We have permits. This ramp is legal. The city approved it. The city, dear? Eleanor replied, her voice laced with condescension. And as president of the board, it's my duty to maintain our community standards. This ramp is an eyesore that's bringing down property values. The bulldozer roared to life, the sound a guttural growl that sent a shiver down Mark's spine. His stomach plummeted. He frantically pulled out his phone and started recording, his hand trembling slightly. "This is illegal," he said, his voice surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. "You can't just demolish someone's property without a court order." Eleanor laughed, a high-pitched, grating sound that made Mark's skin crawl. "Notice was given 3 weeks ago via certified mail. We have the receipt right here." She held up a flimsy piece of paper with a signature Mark had never seen before. He frantically dialed David's number, but it went straight to voicemail. Of course. David was in a closed-door budget meeting today. Mark tried his assistant, his security team, anyone he could think of, but no one answered. Meanwhile, the construction workers were placing bright orange cones around the driveway, preparing for the ramp's destruction. "If you do this," Mark warned, his voice growing louder, attracting the attention of sleepy neighbors, "you'll be hearing from our lawyers. This is a violation of federal disability laws." Eleanor's smile faltered for a split second, a flicker of doubt in her eyes, but she quickly recovered. "The HOA is exempt from no HOA is exempt from federal law." Mark shouted, loud enough that lights started flicking on in neighboring houses. Mr. Henderson, their usually timid neighbor, poked his head out of his front door, then quickly disappeared back inside when he saw Eleanor. But he wasn't the only one watching. More neighbors were gathering, phones raised, recording every agonizing moment. The bulldozer operator hesitated, glancing at the growing crowd. For a fleeting moment, Mark thought he might back down, but then Eleanor gave him a sharp, imperious nod. The machine roared to life again, its massive metal blade lowering inexorably toward the ramp. "This is your last chance, Eleanor," Mark said, his phone still recording, his voice tight with controlled fury. "You're making a huge mistake." Eleanor's eyes gleamed with cold determination. "The only mistake," she hissed, "was allowing this monstrosity to be built in the first place." The bulldozer blade caught the edge of the ramp with a terrible screech of metal on concrete. Chunks of the carefully constructed ramp began to crumble and fall. Mark's hands tightened around his phone as he watched the senseless destruction unfold, his heart aching with a mixture of rage and helplessness. Just then, his phone buzzed with a text message from David's head of security, "Stay calm. Help is 3 minutes out." For the first time that morning, a small, hopeful smile touched Mark's lips. Eleanor, lost in her petty triumph, didn't notice the sleek black SUVs turning onto their street or the faint sound of approaching sirens. She was about to learn the hard way that some rules weren't meant to be broken. The screech of the bulldozer's blade against the concrete seemed to echo down the street, the sound of destruction cutting through the fragile morning air. Mark's phone continued to record, capturing every agonizing detail, the bulldozer's relentless assault, Eleanor's smug expression, and the growing crowd of bewildered neighbors standing in stunned disbelief. The moment felt surreal, like a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. Just as Mark was about to rush forward and physically stop the bulldozer himself, the first black SUV pulled onto the street, its tires crunching ominously against the asphalt. Then another, and another. Sirens wailed in the distance, their piercing cries growing louder, red and blue lights flashing against the facades of the houses. The bulldozer operator abruptly cut the engine, confusion flashing across his face. Eleanor's triumphant smile faltered, then vanished completely as the SUVs rolled to a stop. The back door of the center SUV opened, and David emerged, his wheelchair descending smoothly on an automatic lift. Dressed in a sharp navy blazer, the state seal gleaming on a pin affixed to his lapel, He looked every bit the powerful politician he was. His security detail flanked him on either side, their eyes scanning the scene with practiced precision. Eleanor's eyes widened in disbelief and dawning horror. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice losing its usual shrill confidence. David wheeled forward, calm and collected, his expression unreadable. The crowd parted silently to make way for him, phones still raised, capturing every dramatic second. "Good morning, Eleanor," David said smoothly, his voice carrying clearly over the murmurs of the gathering crowd. "I believe we have a bit of a misunderstanding here." Eleanor crossed her arms, trying to regain control of a rapidly deteriorating situation. "There's no misunderstanding. This ramp is in violation of HOA guidelines. We're simply enforcing the rules to maintain the neighborhood's standards." David smiled politely, but there was steel in his gaze. "Actually, Eleanor, this ramp was approved by the city and complies with all state and federal regulations, including the Americans with Disabilities Act. What you're doing here isn't just wrong. It's illegal." Gasps rippled through the stunned crowd. Mark fought back a triumphant grin as he caught the mix of shock and panic on Eleanor's face. Eleanor cleared her throat, still clinging to her clipboard like it was a life raft. "The HOA has its own set of guidelines. We're exempt from no HOA is exempt from federal law," David interrupted, his voice firm but measured. "And as of this moment, the state is officially opening an investigation into your actions." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Several neighbors exchanged knowing glances, their eyes narrowing in suspicion. Mr. Rodriguez, who had been watching silently from his front steps, finally stepped forward. "About time someone held her accountable," he muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Eleanor's smile was now completely gone. She took a step back, her expensive heel sinking slightly into the soft grass. I think we should take this discussion offline," she stammered, her eyes darting nervously between David and the growing crowd. "Oh, we'll definitely be continuing this discussion," David said, his tone casual but laced with authority. "But for now, I think you owe my brother and me an explanation for why you forged documents and ordered the demolition of our ramp without due process." The crowd fell silent again, waiting for Eleanor's desperate response. "I didn't forge anything," she said, her voice rising in pitch, teetering on the edge of hysteria. "This is all a misunderstanding." Mark raised his phone higher, a smug satisfaction creeping into his voice. "Really? Because I've got video proof of you discussing the demolition with those two men yesterday. You even mentioned the bulldozer arriving at 7 a.m. sharp." Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but before she could utter a word, one of the construction workers spoke up, his voice filled with nervous apprehension. "She told us it was all approved," he said, glancing nervously at the growing number of onlookers. "We had no idea this wasn't legal." Mark caught David's eye, and they both knew the tide had decisively turned. "Looks like you've been caught in a bit of a lie, Eleanor," David said, leaning back in his wheelchair, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "I suggest you cooperate fully with the investigation. It'll go a lot easier for you that way." Just then, the sirens grew deafeningly louder, and two state police cruisers pulled up alongside the SUVs. Two uniformed officers stepped out, their eyes scanning the chaotic scene. "Eleanor Harding?" one of them said, holding up a badge. "We're with the state's fraud investigation unit. We'd like to ask you some questions about your recent actions as HOA president." Eleanor took another step back, her face draining of color, leaving her looking pale and sickly. "This is ridiculous," she sputtered, her voice trembling. "I've done nothing wrong." The officer raised a skeptical eyebrow. "We'll let the evidence decide that." As Eleanor was led away for questioning, the crowd erupted into excited murmurs. Mark lowered his phone, finally letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Did that just happen?" he asked, turning to David, a wide grin spreading across his face. David chuckled softly, a genuine, heartfelt sound. "Oh, it happened. And I have a feeling it's only the beginning." The crowd began to disperse, neighbors whispering excitedly about the extraordinary events they'd just witnessed. Several of them stopped to shake David's hand, thanking him for standing up to Eleanor's tyranny. Mark watched as Mr. Rodriguez leaned in close to David, a conspiratorial glint in his eye. "I've got some documents you might be interested in," he said quietly. "Eleanor's been running this place like her personal kingdom for years. It's time someone finally put a stop to it." David nodded, his expression serious. "Send them over. We'll make sure they get to the right people." As the last of the police cars drove away, their sirens fading into the distance, Mark and David headed back inside, exhausted but exhilarated. "Well," Mark said, pouring himself a fresh cup of coffee, his hands still slightly shaky, "that was an interesting morning." David smirked, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "You think that's interesting? Wait until the audit starts. I have a feeling we've only scratched the surface." Mark laughed, the tension finally breaking, replaced by a sense of buoyant relief. "You know what? I'm almost looking forward to it." Outside, the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its warm light over Maplewood Heights. The dramatic chaos of the morning was already fading into memory, but one thing was certain: the tables had turned, and Eleanor Harding's reign of terror was finally, decisively coming to an end. For the first time in months, Mark felt a genuine sense of hope. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but now they had the upper hand, and they were just getting started. The day after Eleanor's dramatic removal from the scene, Maplewood Heights was buzzing with gossip. What had started as a simple neighborhood dispute had exploded into the talk of the town. News vans lined the streets, reporters swarming the sidewalk in front of Mark and David's house, eager for a statement. David stood in front of a hastily erected podium on their lawn, facing the eager press with calm authority. Mark stood beside him, phone in hand, diligently recording the entire event for their records. The neighborhood gathered once again, their curiosity far too strong to resist. "Ladies and gentlemen," David began, his voice steady and clear, resonating with conviction, "what happened yesterday was not just a personal attack on me or my brother. It was an attack on every resident's right to live without harassment or abuse of power. And as it turns out, this is only the tip of the iceberg." Gasps rippled through the attentive crowd. "As of this morning, I've requested a full investigation into the financial records of the Maplewood Heights HOA," David continued, his gaze sweeping over the assembled reporters and neighbors. "What we've already discovered is troubling, to say the least." Eleanor, who had somehow slipped back into the crowd unnoticed, froze, her face paling. Mark caught sight of her clutching her phone, frantically texting. Probably calling her lawyer, he thought with a grim smirk. The press conference concluded, but the real action was just beginning. By mid-afternoon, Mark's inbox was flooded with emails from neighbors, each sharing their own harrowing stories of Eleanor's petty tyranny and abuse of power. Mrs. Henderson across the street revealed that Eleanor had fined her for her granddaughter's bright pink bicycle being visible in the driveway. Mr. Thompson recounted how Eleanor had forced him to repaint his mailbox not once, not twice, but 3 times because it didn't precisely match the community color palette. But the most damning stories came from Mr. Rodriguez and Mrs. Chen. Mr. Rodriguez presented Mark with a thick stack of documents detailing how Eleanor had not only fined him for installing a wheelchair ramp for his ailing father but had also brazenly taken funds directly from the HOA budget to pay for extensive personal renovations on her own house, new hardwood floors, a sprawling backyard patio, and even a luxurious hot tub, all conveniently charged to the HOA under the guise of community improvements. Mrs. Chen added further fuel to the fire, sharing a secretly recorded video clip of Eleanor bragging at a neighborhood dinner party about how incredibly easy it was to redirect HOA funds for her own pet projects. Mark and David sat in their living room that evening, the sheer volume of evidence spread across their coffee table like a damning indictment. Mark shook his head in utter disbelief. "She's been running this place like her own personal piggy bank." David nodded grimly. "And it's high time we put an end to it." The next morning, they called an emergency neighborhood meeting at the community center. For the first time in years, the room was packed, Not with Eleanor's loyal enforcers, but with residents eager for answers and, more importantly, justice. Mark took the microphone first, his voice filled with righteous indignation as he laid out the mountain of evidence they had painstakingly collected. The room grew eerily quiet with each new shocking revelation. Photos of Eleanor's lavish renovations flashed on the projector screen, followed by copies of falsified financial reports and signed witness statements from terrified neighbors. Then, David took over, his voice strong and authoritative, resonating with the power of his office. "This isn't just about one corrupt HOA president," he declared, his gaze sweeping over the captivated audience. "This is about changing how HOAs operate across the entire state. No one should have to live in fear of harassment or financial exploitation. That's why I'm introducing new legislation to protect homeowners from exactly this kind of egregious abuse." The crowd erupted into thunderous applause, a wave of relief and hope washing over the room. But before the meeting could officially wrap up, the doors burst open with a dramatic crash, and Eleanor stormed in, her face flushed with unbridled fury, her eyes blazing with indignant rage. "You can't do this!" she shrieked, her voice echoing through the stunned silence. "This is a private HOA matter. You have absolutely no right to interfere." David didn't even flinch. "Actually, Eleanor, we do. And given the overwhelming evidence of your extensive misconduct, I'd say you're in serious trouble." Just then, a state investigator stepped forward, holding up a crisp, official-looking arrest warrant. "Eleanor Harding, you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and multiple violations of state housing laws." Eleanor's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, her composure finally cracking. "You can't prove anything," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Mark chuckled, holding up his phone with a triumphant grin. "Oh, I think we've got plenty of proof. Want to see the video where you personally ordered the demolition of our legally permitted ramp? Or perhaps the signed receipts for your community improvements at your own private residence?" Eleanor's shoulders slumped in defeated resignation as two uniformed officers gently but firmly led her out of the community center. The room exploded into cheers, a collective exhale of years of pent-up frustration. But David raised his hands, calling for silence. "This isn't just about taking Eleanor down," he said, his voice filled with a newfound sense of purpose. "It's about building something better. We have a chance to create a community where people look out for each other, not tear each other down. And it starts today." That night, the neighborhood felt lighter than it had in years. People lingered outside, talking and laughing, the oppressive shadow of Eleanor Harding's reign of terror finally lifted. But a nagging feeling lingered in the back of Mark's mind, a sense that there was still more to uncover. He sat on the porch, scrolling through emails, when one in particular caught his eye. It was from someone named Michael Peterson, who claimed to be a former board member from one of Eleanor's previous neighborhoods. "You think you've seen it all?" the email read. "Trust me, you haven't. Call me." Mark stared at the screen for a long moment before picking up his phone. "Hey, David," he said, his voice low and serious. "We're not done yet." David wheeled out onto the porch, a curious look on his face. "What is it?" Mark handed him the phone, his eyes wide with a mixture of apprehension and determination. "We've got a new lead. And if this guy's telling the truth, things are about to get a whole lot more interesting." The morning after Eleanor's arrest, Maplewood Heights felt like a completely different place. Gone was the oppressive air of constant surveillance and petty fines. Neighbors who had once avoided each other out of fear now gathered on front lawns, talking and laughing like old friends reunited after a long separation. Mark stood on his porch, savoring his morning coffee and watching the remarkable transformation unfold. Mr. Rodriguez was outside, tending to his vibrant garden, this time without the looming threat of a violation notice for his beloved collection of decorative gnomes. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson happily helped her granddaughter adorn her bright pink bicycle with colorful streamers. It felt right. David rolled out onto the porch beside him, a satisfied grin stretching across his face. "Feels like the neighborhood is finally waking up," he observed, his voice filled with quiet satisfaction. Mark nodded in agreement. "It's about time." But he knew, deep down, that there was still important work to be done. Later that day, the newly appointed interim HOA board, comprised of longtime residents with no interest in power games, held its first official meeting. David and Mark were invited as honorary guests, and the atmosphere was surprisingly relaxed, a stark contrast to the tense, confrontational meetings of the past. The very first item on the agenda? Rebuilding the wheelchair ramp. "Not just rebuilt," Mr. Rodriguez says, a warm smile spreading across his face, "we're going to make it better." And that's exactly what they did. The entire neighborhood rallied around the project. Local contractors generously donated their time and materials. Talented artists from the community offered to paint the ramp with vibrant, uplifting designs. Even the neighborhood kids pitched in with an infectious enthusiasm that only children possess. What had once been a plain, functional structure was transformed into a breathtaking work of art, a powerful testament to resilience and the true meaning of community. When it was finally finished, the ramp wasn't just practical. It was beautiful. Covered in hand-painted flowers that seemed to bloom in the sunlight and glowing softly at night with embedded LED lights, it became a symbol of what Maplewood Heights could be, a place where everyone was genuinely welcome and wholeheartedly supported. At the grand unveiling, David rolled down the ramp for the first time, a collective cheer erupting from the gathered crowd as he reached the bottom. He looked up at the sea of friendly faces, the neighbors who had come together to make it happen, and for a moment, his voice caught with emotion. "This isn't just a ramp," he said finally, his voice thick with gratitude. "It's a reminder that when we stand together, there's absolutely nothing we can't overcome. Thank you all for being a part of this." Thunderous applause filled the air, and Mark couldn't help but laugh with pure joy as kids eagerly ran up to test out the ramp, racing their bikes down its gentle slope. But the celebration was only just beginning. That evening, David hosted a massive neighborhood barbecue in their backyard. The tantalizing smell of grilled burgers and hot dogs filled the air, mingling with the happy sound of laughter echoing through the yard. Mr. Rodriguez brought his famous, mouth-watering tamales, while Mrs. Chen set up a dessert table overflowing with an irresistible array of homemade treats. Mark watched it all unfold with a profound sense of pride and relief. This was what community was supposed to be, people coming together in joyful unity, not tearing each other apart with petty rules and power struggles. Midway through the lively barbecue, David tapped a glass with a spoon, calling for everyone's attention. "I've got one more announcement," he said, a mischievous twinkle in his eye. "As many of you know, I've been working closely with state legislators on a new bill. Today, I am incredibly proud to tell you that the Homeowner Protection Act has officially been introduced." The crowd erupted into another wave of enthusiastic cheers, and Mark felt a surge of pride for his determined brother. David continued, his voice filled with sincerity, "And I want to say something else. This isn't just about laws. It's fundamentally about how we treat each other. We've all learned a lot these past few months. Let's not forget these valuable lessons. Let's truly make Maplewood Heights a place where everyone feels welcome, respected, and supported." A few feet away, Mrs. Henderson wiped away a tear, whispering to her neighbor, "It's about time." But the evening wasn't all serious speeches and deep reflections. There was plenty of light-hearted laughter and good-natured fun. Mr. Thompson attempted to impress the kids with his juggling skills, which hilariously resulted in them dropping a plate of deviled eggs. Mark challenged Mr. Rodriguez to a hot dog eating contest and lost spectacularly. Even David joined in the fun, racing down the new ramp with the neighborhood kids cheering him on with unbridled enthusiasm. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in breathtaking hues of deep purple and fiery orange, Mark stood at the edge of the yard, watching the neighbors gathered around the crackling fire pit, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. David wheeled up beside him, a contented smile gracing his face. "We did good, Mark," he said softly. Mark chuckled, a genuine, heartfelt sound. "We did, didn't we?" For the first time in months, There was no tension in the air, no lingering fear of what Eleanor might do next. The neighborhood finally felt whole again. But just as Mark thought the dramatic saga was finally over, his phone buzzed with a new email. It was from Michael Peterson, the former board member who had contacted him earlier. Mark opened it, quickly scanning the message. His eyes widened in disbelief. "What is it?" David asked, noticing the sudden change in Mark's expression. "You are not going to believe this," Mark said, his voice laced with astonishment, holding out the phone for David to read. Turns out Eleanor's little scheme might be part of something much, much bigger. David leaned in, reading the email, his brow furrowing in concern. "Looks like we've got more digging to do." Mark grinned, a spark of determination igniting in his eyes. "You ready for round two?" David smirked, a familiar glint of resolve returning to his gaze. "Always." The night carried on around them, filled with the warmth of community and newfound hope, but the wheels were already turning. Maplewood Heights had won its first hard-fought battle, but a new, potentially larger war was looming on the horizon. And this time, Mark and David were more than ready for whatever came next. The next morning, Mark sat at the kitchen table, his phone clutched in his hand, his gaze fixed on the shocking email from Michael Peterson. The words on the screen seemed almost too outrageous to believe. According to Michael, Eleanor wasn't just a rogue HOA president with a thirst for power. She was a key player in a much larger, more insidious scheme. She was systematically funneling HOA funds into a shadowy network of shady contractors, Mark read aloud to David, his voice filled with disbelief. Companies that specialize in fixing violations but charge 5 times the standard rate. They'd split the exorbitant profit with her, then move on to the next unsuspecting neighborhood. David leaned back in his wheelchair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully, his sharp mind already piecing together the puzzle. So, it wasn't just about the ramp. She's been doing this for years, hopping from one neighborhood to another, building her own little corrupt empire. Mark nodded grimly. And from the looks of it, the very contracting company she hired to demolish our ramp is right in the middle of it. It didn't take long for Mark and David to delve deeper into the rabbit hole of corruption. Armed with the damning evidence provided by Michael and their own meticulous investigation, they uncovered a sprawling web of fraud and deceit that extended far beyond the manicured lawns of Maplewood Heights. Eleanor had forged partnerships with multiple unscrupulous contracting firms across the state, pocketing substantial kickbacks for every overpriced emergency repair she conveniently authorized. "I think it's high time we paid a little visit to that contractor," Mark said, closing his laptop with a determined snap, his eyes blazing with righteous anger. They drove to the sleek, modern headquarters of Brighton Contracting, a glass-fronted building that looked far too opulent for a small, local construction firm. Mark had expected some resistance, perhaps even outright denial, but when they walked into the pristine lobby and flashed their credentials, the impeccably dressed receptionist's face went ashen. "One moment, please," she stammered, disappearing quickly into the back offices. Minutes later, they were ushered into a large, expensively furnished office where a man in a perfectly tailored suit waited for them. He introduced himself with a practiced smile as Carl Whitaker, the company's CEO. His handshake was firm, but there was an unsettling, predatory glint in his eyes. "Gentlemen," Carl said, gesturing to the plush chairs in front of his expansive desk, "what can I do for you today?" David didn't waste a single second on pleasantries. "We know about the kickbacks, the grossly inflated repair costs, and your long-standing partnership with Eleanor Harding," he stated firmly, leaning forward in his wheelchair, his gaze locking directly with Carl's. "You've been systematically exploiting homeowners for years, and it ends now." Carl's practiced smile faltered, a flicker of surprise and perhaps a hint of fear crossing his features. "That's a very serious accusation. Do you have proof?" Mark slid a thick folder across the polished mahogany desk. "Plenty. Financial records, incriminating emails, signed witness statements. We've got everything we need to take this entire sordid affair public." For a tense moment, Carl's face remained unreadable. Then, To their surprise, a low chuckle rumbled in his chest. "Well, you've certainly done your homework," he conceded, a hint of grudging admiration in his voice. "But let me make you a very generous offer. You walk away from all of this, and I'll make sure you're both very comfortable. A substantial settlement, no strings attached." David raised a skeptical eyebrow, a wry smile playing on his lips. "You're attempting to bribe a sitting state senator?" Carl shrugged, his predatory eyes gleaming. "I prefer to think of it as a mutually beneficial business arrangement." David's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "Here's my counteroffer, Carl. You cooperate fully with the state investigation, you shut down your little scam, and maybe, just maybe, you'll avoid spending the next several years in a federal penitentiary." Carl's smile disappeared entirely. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair, crossing his arms defensively. "You're making a huge mistake. You think you can take us down? We've got connections, powerful ones." Mark leaned forward, his voice low and steady, filled with unwavering conviction. "So do we. And we're not afraid to use them." The tension in the opulent office was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. But Carl, a seasoned businessman, seemed to finally recognize that he had been outmaneuvered. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders slumping ever so slightly in defeat. "Fine," he conceded, his voice flat. "What do you want?" "Full cooperation," David stated firmly. "Names, financial records, everything." "And you'll testify against Eleanor?" Carl nodded reluctantly, his eyes filled with a mixture of resentment and resignation. "You'll have it all by the end of the week." As they left the imposing office building, the midday sun glinting off its cold glass facade, Mark felt a surge of triumph. "I think we just hit the jackpot," he said, a wide grin spreading across his face. David nodded, his expression serious. "But we're not done yet. We've got to make absolutely sure this sticks." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. The evidence Carl provided was explosive, implicating dozens of other corrupt contractors and complicit HOA officials across the state. David held another press conference, this time with representatives from the state attorney's office standing firmly by his side. The story exploded, making national headlines, finally exposing the widespread corruption and fraud that had silently plagued countless neighborhoods for far too long. But the most profoundly satisfying moment came exactly 1 week later when Eleanor Harding was formally charged with conspiracy, fraud, and embezzlement. The footage of her being escorted out of the courthouse in handcuffs, her perfectly coiffed hair slightly disheveled and her face a mask of shocked disbelief, quickly went viral, with headlines like "HOA Queen Falls from Grace" splashed across every news outlet. Back in Maplewood Heights, life slowly returned to something resembling peaceful normalcy. The new, democratically elected HOA board worked tirelessly to rebuild trust within the community, holding open meetings and implementing fair, transparent policies. The old, dreaded violations office was even converted into a community help center, where residents could get assistance with home repairs and other essential needs. One sunny afternoon, as Mark sat on his porch, finally enjoying a moment of quiet tranquility, a large moving truck pulled up in front of Eleanor's old house. A young family of 5 stepped out, a cheerful couple with 3 energetic kids and the playful golden retriever. The father noticed Mark and waved enthusiastically. "Hey there. We're the Thompsons. Just moved in." Mark smiled warmly and walked over to introduce himself. "Welcome to the neighborhood. Need a hand unloading?" The man grinned gratefully. "That would be great. Oh, and by the way, thanks for the ramp. It's absolutely perfect for my mom. She's in a wheelchair, and it's so hard to find houses that can accommodate that." Mark looked at the sturdy, beautifully painted ramp, a symbol of their hard-won victory, and then back at the friendly, hopeful family. "It's all yours," he said, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "And don't worry, no one's tearing it down this time." As neighbors gathered to warmly welcome and help the new family settle in, David rolled up beside Mark, a deep, contented smile on his face. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Ethan said softly. Mark nodded, his heart filled with a quiet sense of accomplishment. Yeah. We didn't just fix the neighborhood. We changed it for good. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden light over the peaceful streets of Maplewood Heights. The dark days of Eleanor's oppressive reign were now a distant, unpleasant memory. But Mark knew one thing for sure: if any other corrupt HOAs out there thought they could take advantage of his neighborhood, they had another thing coming. Because the Johnsons weren't just survivors. They were fighters. And they never, ever gave up. Valuable lesson: the story of Maplewood Heights serves as a powerful reminder that even seemingly small acts of injustice, when left unchecked, can escalate into significant problems. It highlights the importance of community engagement, the courage to stand up against corruption, and the power of collective action in bringing about positive change. It also underscores the vital role of transparency and accountability in any organization, especially those that hold authority over people's homes and lives. What are your thoughts on this story? Have you ever experienced or witnessed similar issues in your own neighborhood? Share your comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring and thought-provoking content.